Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I'm delighted to be able to welcome you back here and to particularly welcome Dr. Iain McGilchrist. Dr. McGilchrist is a former Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, a Fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and a former consultant psychiatrist and clinical director at the Bethlem Royal and Maudsley Hospital in London. He was a research fellow in neuroimaging at Johns Hopkins Hospital, Baltimore, has published original articles and research papers in a wide range of publications on topics in literature, medicine, and psychiatry. Perhaps he's best known for an extraordinary book published by Yale in November 2009, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. Would you please welcome Dr. Iain McGilchrist.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for that introduction, and indeed for inviting me, and thank you too very much to Roger and Ray for including me in this event. I loved Ray's mention yesterday of a researcher who needed to prove that her subject's behavior had really changed by doing a scan. The triumph of theory over practice. I'll have something to say about that. But of course it sort of boils down to the idea that nothing's real unless we can see the brain correlates for it. And of course there was a huge amount of excitement when somebody found what they called the neural circuitry that lights up when you fall in love. I mean, up until then we didn't know whether people really fell in love or not. And of course the suggestion is slightly more sinister, which is that what really happens is this stuff goes on in the brain, and it's nothing but that. Well, you know, something lights up in my brain when I eat a cheese sandwich, but it's not going to be significant, and I'm not going to be giving you nothing buttery today. I will not be claiming that the brain can tell us things we could never under any circumstances have come to know about the phenomenological world. Nonetheless, knowledge about the brain can, I believe, cast light on, help us to get a handle on, not what the phenomenological world is, but why certain aspects of the phenomenological world are inevitably disposed the way they are, a different matter. I suppose you could think of it as being a bit like the knowledge a map gives you. Strictly speaking, there's nothing on a map you couldn't have worked out for yourself by wandering about in the rain for quite a while. I believe it can, this kind of knowledge, help illuminate the constraints on our understanding of the world. It gives us a perspective on some ways of thinking that otherwise might seem more cogent than in fact they are. Looking at the brain may, funnily enough, even help us get a clearer view of the folly of trying to reduce a person to a brain. It may show us that only one half of our brains, the half that sees less, would incline us to think that way. Suppose it could be shown, and it can, that our brains are so constructed as to enable us to bring into being and conceive the experiential world in two quite distinct, coherent, complementary, but ultimately incompatible ways, both of which have their uses, and that these versions of the world, which have importantly different qualities, are generally so well combined or alternated from moment to moment in everyday life that individuals are not aware of this being the case. And suppose also that it could be shown, and it can, that these views of or takes on the world are not equally well grounded. The part of the brain that makes one of these views possible takes into account more and better integrated information over a broader range than the other. One sees more in the broadest sense of that word. And suppose it could be shown, because it can, that while most people most of the time draw on each, individuals often show a bias towards drawing on one more than the other, particularly in certain contexts, with predictable results for that person's understanding of the world. Moreover, suppose, because this is in fact demonstrably the case, that persons who are obliged to rely on the part of the brain which sees less tend to be unreasonably certain, more rigid and exclusive than those who are, for similar reasons, obliged to rely on the part that sees more, who are more tentative and more able to see other points of view. Partly as a result of this, one might expect that even for those of us who have intact brains, the more limited way would tend to reinforce itself, with the result that the other, broader way of experiencing, conceiving, or understanding could, be blocked out for considerable periods of time, and that where this happens, that faculty might become progressively harder to access. And that is, by the way, what one finds. What is more, for a number of reasons, this effect, like everything else in the brain, is asymmetrical. And much as a bias can become characteristic of an individual's thinking, it could become characteristic of the thinking of the group of individuals who shape a culture. I'm sure there are those who claim that all this could add nothing to the discussion of the nature of the world. We can just proceed, they might say, from experience, ignoring the brain, and that will tell us everything we need to know. But I'm not so sure they'd want to throw away the insights it may give. I would claim this knowledge about the brain would add at least something to our deliberations. For one thing, it would suggest that many differences of view about the nature of humankind, society, life, and the world itself, whether these take the form of philosophical disputes or differing movements in the broader history of ideas in a culture, may be due not so much to different lines of reasoning about things or events in the same experiential world, but due to reasoning about what are essentially different worlds. This is not a point so easily discerned under normal non-experimental conditions, because in those circumstances one has no easy way of becoming aware that one's consciousness is constantly synthesizing two quite opposed takes on the world. One would be able to see only that it was hard to resolve many problems about the nature of the world by reasoning, but that presumably one side must logically defeat the other if only we could think straight. This kind of knowledge about the brain would help us to see that each view of the world is inevitably available for all subjects and has its part to play in the experience of all, so that there is no sense in the idea that one of these could finally be proved right and the other wrong. Nonetheless, it would demonstrate that one take sees more than the other and forms a better basis for understanding, and that while each has something different to tell us, one is able to include that perception of non-exclusivity in its broader view, suggesting that the very desire to clinch one view as right and the other as wrong might just be part of a limited vision of the world at large. Under all these circumstances, I believe that philosophers might just have reason to be interested, and in fact, a number have been foolhardy enough to let on that they are. Please note that I am not suggesting that we are the puppets or playthings of our brains which really drive these shifts in the history of ideas. We, human persons, drive the history of ideas. But every single thing we experience subtly alters the brain's function, and at the micro level its structure, which then subtly alters our capacity to experience certain things in the future. And both our experience and the brain that helps shape it and is shaped by it alter how we interact with and mold our environment, which in turn molds us and our brains. Our experience, our brains, and the environment are not artificially to be isolated, but are parts of a dynamic, plastic whole. There are a number of false antitheses here, sharp distinctions that have the ring of confidence that comes from clarity, but are actually a hindrance to understanding. One should be as clear as the situation permits, but no clearer. Some kinds of clarity are themselves illusory, an imposition of categories and terms on a reality that's betrayed in the process. That leads me to the vexed question of language about the brain. Language didn't evolve in such a way as to be applied easily to the brain and its functions. It evolved out of day-to-day experience. And in day-to-day experience, provided all's going according to plan, we're not aware of our brains and their contribution to everything that is human at all. Our increasing knowledge over the last century and a half of the close relationship between personality, emotion, and cognition on the one hand, and the brain that makes them possible on the other, arose from painstaking observations. But it didn't come ready equipped with any language at its disposal other than that contemporaneously used to describe a machine, originally that of hydraulics, later of telephonics, electronics, and now cybernetics. There was and is no obviously unproblematic language with which to describe the brain, what it is and what it does, since it is entirely sui generis. Some trends in philosophy run a high risk of distorting the person by abstracting mentation, and particularly focusing on conscious thought processes. Much of what constitutes a person lies outside his or her conscious awareness. One answer to the Libet experiments is that we need to expand the idea of who we are. We cannot disown aspects of our functioning just because they're unconscious. We may not be aware of doing something, but it's still we who are doing it. Everyday language cannot deal adequately with the realm of unconscious processes either. It encourages us to be too cut and dried. As our knowledge of who we are expands, the language has to become flexible, extend its compass with it, or risk splitting off persons and their bodies. And of course, a person is not a ghost in a machine. I think we can agree that. It's not an abstraction residing in a body like a marble in a box, or as Descartes said, like a sailor in a ship. Persons are embodied beings. This accords with our experience of one another as persons, and of ourselves, with our feelings, judgments, intuitions, skills, memories, and moods, all of which are dependent on our embodied state. Their dependence on the body extends, in fact, much further than the brain. The heart and the gut, for example, which we think of as metaphors for parts of our mental life, are also literally involved, so even is the musculature. Feelings and the body are hugely interdependent, and if feelings are part of our personhood, so is our body. And it gets worse, or better, depending on how you see it. Even in the cases where feeling can easily be distinguished from thought, the two are also highly interdependent. This is recognized in Aristotle's idea of phronesis, and more broadly in ideas such as intuition and wisdom, which refer to something more than mere ratiocination. It's also demonstrably the case, as Antonio Damasio has visibly shown, that persons who by reason of brain injury have diminished capacity for feeling, but apparently intact faculties of reason, fail to be able to reason effectively about real-life situations. Although we can often make a useful distinction between thought and feeling, at times it becomes so hard to distinguish one from the other that the exercise seems artificial and trivial, and to do violence to the phenomena we're trying to describe. Our feelings and our bodies are inextricably involved with everything that counts towards our personhood. So, how are we to talk about the body, and in particular about the brain, as part of that person? All in language, of course, implies some model, and there are drawbacks to every model, which will emphasize some aspects at the expense of others, and will inevitably be no more than an approximation. If we liken the brain to a machine made up of the interconnections of billions of circuits or wires, we see some things, but we distort others. For a start, a neuron's not at all like any existing chip or wire. And the metaphor makes us as persons falsely remote from this machine we ghosts must then inhabit. Yet if we think of a brain hemisphere as part of the person, we also run into problems. We certainly don't want to say that the brain hemispheres in the body are all there is to a person. But the model of a hemisphere as having some of the features of a person is less of a distortion, I would contend, than that of the machine. The problem could be put like this. To the extent that we approximate the brain and the person, we risk reducing the person to the brain. But to the extent that we distance them, we risk introducing a homunculus, a ghost in the machine. I'm not a fan of either of the popular ways of loosing this Gordian knot, which is to say that one or other of the strands that go to compose it simply doesn't exist. This may look like it's not dualism, but it's really just the same old dualism with one of the realms declared void. Any solution that ignores our amphibian nature is not a solution. However, to allow the closeness of the person and the brain is not necessarily reductive. We're obliged to conclude that matter is itself something extraordinary if it can give rise, after millions of years, to something quite as extraordinary as the brain, and perhaps, though that is not my belief, consciousness. It must itself be something that is no easier than consciousness to explain. We haven't reduced mind to matter, except that in the sense that we've recognized that these two entities, neither of them easily defined, are closely linked, whether matter is thought of as mediating consciousness or originating it. I hope, however, that we can move beyond a debate about language. There's something urgent here that won't just go away, pack its bags, and peaceably accept the verdict that it doesn't exist because we have a disagreement about how exactly to describe it in words. Speaking as a clinician rather than as a philosopher, I've been struck forcefully by the way in which aspects of the world or persons change or even disappear forever after a person has a stroke or other injury to the brain. And of course, in a way, this is hardly surprising. If we have an injury to the eye or the ear, we may no longer be able to see or hear. The realms of the visible and the audible continue to exist, but we might have no access to them. And in fact, of course, what we as humans can see or hear is already limited by what our organs can detect. What they can tell us is there. Bats and bears hear and see things we cannot. Our brains are like filters. Presumably there's a multiplicity of potential phenomena that we humans are not aware of because we have no means to experience them. And when the brain is injured, the injury can have a drastic effect on the world as experienced. Our world is what our senses and ultimately our brains permit us to experience. They shape and constrain it. The world's not equal to the brain correlates of experience, but it is constrained and dependent on them. In what follows, I will often speak of a hemisphere of the brain as if it were a person, valuing, feeling, thinking, or attending to the world in a certain way. What I intend by this is not to claim identity between a hemisphere and a person, but rather to indicate that the correct functioning of that particular hemisphere is necessary for a person to value, feel, think, or attend in a certain way. Conversely, damage to it restricts or abolishes a person's capacity to value, feel, think, or attend in that way. But this kind of talk is tedious. I promise to avoid such cumbersome circumlocutions, provided you bear in mind that their meaning is implied. Incidentally, that one is not aware of depending on part of the brain when one carries out some task as a person is not an argument that one is not in fact depending on it. And how the brain restricts what we see is potentially of significance to all of us. Now, if we take a look at the brain lying there on the pathologist's slab, the first thing that will strike us is that despite millions of years of evolution, it has remained deeply divided. And that is odd, since the whole purpose of the brain, as we understand it, is to make connections. Its whole power is in those connections. So how can this be? Evolution would never have sacrificed the apparent advantage of massively greater interconnectivity unless there were a commanding advantage in, at the same time, keeping some things apart. Well, in conceiving and writing The Master in His Hemisphere, I spent 20 years amassing, studying, and reflecting on whatever research I could find that concerned the difference between the brain hemispheres. This wasn't altogether an easy task. The first problem was one of prejudice. In the early days after the first split brain operations, it seemed that we were onto something big. The left hemisphere, we learnt, was rational, hard-nosed, down-to-earth, and linguistic, while the right hemisphere was pink and fluffy, emotional, creative, vague, and given to painting pictures. But the excitement waned as we found that the story was more complicated. Gradually, with unfolding research, it became obvious that both hemispheres seemed to contribute to language, both to visual imagery. Both were involved in reason, and both in emotion, which were inextricably involved with one another. In fact, it didn't matter what it was our brains were engaged in, both hemispheres were in it up to the neck, or whatever a hemisphere has for a neck. Then there was a Volvo ad about the car feel right brain. That did it. From then on, no self-respecting scientist could be found to touch the topic. There developed in reaction to this a dogma that it wasn't worth looking at the issue because there simply was no difference between the two hemispheres. Dogma is not too strong a word. Even now, you'll sometimes hear the emphatic, confident, dismissive tones in the pronouncements of those who've never bothered to look. The inquiry was closed down. And this too is fascinating, particularly in the light of what I want to come on to shortly, because this belief has nothing to do with observable facts. Indeed, it flies right in the face of them. It's purely an article of faith, one that leads us to turn away from a truly scientific approach, because the brain is not only profoundly divided, but profoundly asymmetrical. There are clear, observable differences at every level. The two hemispheres are different sizes, shapes, and weights. The right hemisphere is bigger and heavier in all social mammals, have expansions in different areas, different gyral conformations on the surface, and in places different cytoarchitecture, different proportions of grey matter to white, different sensitivity to neuroendocrine influences, and rely on different preponderances of neurotransmitters. And in psychometric testing, they consistently yield different results, which is in keeping with something any clinician could tell you. When there's damage to one hemisphere or the other through injury, tumor, or stroke, there are consistent differences in what happens to the subject and his world, depending on which hemisphere suffers the lesion. What is more, the ratio of the size of the corpus callosum, the band that connects the hemispheres, the principal band, to the cerebral hemispheres has got smaller, not larger, during evolution. Much of the communication across the corpus callosum is in any case ultimately inhibitory in nature. Most of the fibers that cross are glutamatergic and excitatory, but of them a large proportion terminate on GABAergic inhibitory interneurons. Right at the core of our being, staring us in the face, is a massive fact or set of facts which science should have been investigating, not denying. How had this strange dogma, this strange case of denial come about? I think it can be attributed to adopting the wrong model in our attempts to understand what we're looking at. We can only ever understand anything by comparing it with something else that we think we already understand better. We model the brain as part of a machine, the hemispheres as mechanical parts of a mechanical body. There are, of course, only two possible models, seeing it as part of a machine or as part of a person, so we had a 50% chance of getting it right, but we managed to make the wrong choice. Because if instead we'd seen it as part of a person, we would immediately have noticed that we were asking the wrong question. Instead of asking as of a machine what it does it do, reason, emotion, language, imagery, we would have asked as of a person, what's he or she like? How, in other words, with what values, goals, interests, in what manner and in what way did it do what it did? Now, if we ask this question, what sort of a way of engaging with the world each hemisphere has, and thus what sort of a world each hemisphere engages with, we find a pervasive pattern giving rise to an entirely coherent picture. We can only know of the world as we've inevitably shaped it by the nature of our attention. But of course, that doesn't imply that reality is all in our heads, as some postmodernists would seem to suggest. I take it that we bring about a world in consciousness that is partly what is given and partly what we bring, something that comes into being through this particular conjunction and no other. And the key to this is the kind of attention we pay to the world. Attention changes our world. Of course, what we find will govern what kind of attention we deem it appropriate to pay. But just as importantly, how we attend to the world in the first place governs what it is that we find. We help make the world we live in by attending to it in a certain way, by our disposition towards it. Having done so, our experience of it then determines how we attend, and so on. There is no royal road to certainty about what the world is or what it's like. There is, in fact, a hermeneutic circle. We have to begin somewhere, by an intuition as to what kind of thing it might be we're dealing with, and depending on that intuition is what we find. And depending on what we find is what we will find in due course, since it begins the process of hardening things up into what appears illusorily certain. What we do not expect to find, we just will not see. Much elegant research demonstrates that we're essentially blind to what we do not think is there. Gorillas in our midst comes to mind. Such circles prove vicious unless we're constantly vigilant for aspects of experience that do not fit our model. I'll come back to that point later. Now, what does this have to do with the division of the brain? Birds and animals, for they too all have divided brains, have to solve a conundrum every moment of their waking lives. In order to make use of the world, to manipulate it to their own ends, they need to pay narrowly focused attention to what they've already prioritized as of significance to them. A bird needs to be able, for example, to pick out a seed against the background of grit on which it lies, to pick up a particular twig to build a nest, and so on. But if that's the only kind of attention it's paying, it will soon end up as someone else's lunch while it's getting its own, because it needs at the same time to pay a quite different type of attention to the world, a broad, open, sustained vigilance without any preconception of what it may find, be it predator or mate, foe or friend. How to pay such contrary types of attention to the world at once? The solution appears to have been the brain's separate hemispheres. Each of these neuronal masses is sufficient in itself and on its own to sustain consciousness. And since attention is an aspect of consciousness, a machine can carry out tasks, but it cannot attend, each can therefore attend to the world in a different way. What we call our consciousness moves back and forth between them seamlessly, drawing on each as required and often very rapidly. For in birds and animals, and in humans too, it turns out the hemispheres pay different types of attention to the world. Reach out a hand towards it, for that is what the word attention means, Latin ad tendere, the reaching out of a hand, in a different way, or with a different set of priorities and values. to grasp and take for our own use, or to forge a connection and to explore. The left hemisphere, as in birds and animals, pays the narrow beam, precisely focused attention which enables us to get and grasp. It's the left hemisphere that controls the right hand in humans, with which we grasp something, and controls the aspects of language, not all of language, by virtue of which we say we've grasped the meaning, made it certain, and pinned it down. It enables us to manipulate the world, and I use that term in no pejorative sense. The right hemisphere underwrites sustained attention and vigilance for whatever may be, without preconception. Its attention is not in the service of manipulation, but in the service of connection, exploration, and relation. That is, after all, another reason why we reach out a hand: to connect, to create, to share in another's fate, or to explore the world for what it is. Its view, though the left hemisphere's partial view shares in the process as useful handmaiden, its view, the right hemisphere's view, is the basis of understanding. Now, I'm not going to attempt here to do a summary of the differences between the kinds of world that each hemisphere brings about. The list is very extensive, as must be the case, since each hemisphere plays a part in everything we experience. There are important differences between the hemispheres in their ways of conceiving and construing knowledge itself, newness and wholeness, differences in the types and aspects of reason and emotion, and the types and aspects of language that they serve, and differences in the parts they play in the body, music, space, depth, and time, as well as morality and the self. Here I can present only some conclusions. To address these particular areas of experience, to see all the evidence and the argument laid out in comprehensive detail, as you should rightly demand, you need to go to the master and his emissary, where there's space and time enough to show exactly why, and on the basis of what evidence these conclusions are reached. So forgive me if what I say seems a bit thin in terms of argument and factual backup on this occasion. What are the key distinctions? I'm going to try and do some sort of quick and dirty sort of ideas here. One way of looking at the difference would be to say that while the left hemisphere's raison d'etre is to narrow things down to a certainty, the right hemisphere's is to open them up into a possibility. We need both, of course, and in fact, for practical purposes, narrowing things down to a certainty so that we can grasp them is more helpful. But it's also illusory, since certainty itself is an illusion, albeit, as I say, a useful one. There is no certainty in the real world, only degrees of approximation. As Einstein famously said, as far as the laws of mathematics refer to reality, they're not certain, and as far as they're certain, they do not refer to reality. The more closely one pins down one measure, such as the position of a particle, the less precise another measurement pertaining to the same particle, such as its momentum, must become. It's not possible to know the values of all the properties of the system at the same time. Mechanical systems, even at their simplest, are likely to produce highly complex outcomes. Not infrequently, their behavior is intrinsically unpredictable and unknowable. The simple double pendulum, one pendulum attached to the bottom of another, is a classical example of chaotic dynamics. The old fallacious belief that the behavior of all systems was fundamentally predictable, the belief that probably lies behind the recent financial global collapse, arose because the systems studied were abstracted from their real-world complexity and studied very close to equilibrium. It goes without saying that most of the real world is operating far from equilibrium. Elements of matter are neither isolated nor certain, but reverberatively interconnected and probabilistic. Particles separated by a universe exhibit entanglement. Even the fact of our observation alters the behavior of matter. An important consequence of this narrow focus attention aiming for certainty is that it renders everything explicit. Just as a joke is robbed of power where it has to be explained, metaphors and symbols lose their power when rendered explicit. And metaphor is not a decorative turn applied on top of the serious business of language in order to entertain. All thinking, most obviously philosophical and scientific thinking, is at bottom metaphorical in nature, though we're so familiar with the metaphors that we often don't notice their existence. It's the metaphors which provide the something else, which we know more intimately from our embodied preconceptual experience, and to which we are, in every word we use, properly understood, making a comparison. It's metaphors that carry us across, that's what the word metaphor from Greek metapherein means, the implied gap between language and the world, and make what would otherwise be a hermetically sealed system of signs capable of meaning something in terms of embodied experience. They are how we understand everything. It follows that limiting the possible meaning of language by rendering it explicit also limits the possible meaning that could be found in the world. Explicitness kills, renders lifeless. It also decontextualizes. I should venture to assert that the most pervasive fallacy of philosophic thinking goes back to neglect of context, wrote Dewey. Everything depends on context. An act of sexual love or an act of worship reveal little of their true selves in the lab, seen through an observation window, but neither would a football match, a meal with friends, or a comedy show. Context can change the meaning utterly. In the US, for example, there are 4 sizes of cereal packets. Jumbo, which means very large. Economy, which means large. Family, which means medium. And large, which means small. I first wrestled with the problem of context when I was involved with the study and teaching of literature. The meaning and structure are not like a body and its clothes. Once you've taken the apparent message out of its context and examined the language of a poem like a cast-off coat, you're left with a handful of tatters. A poem of Hardy, which if it had not existed could never have been imagined, and which cannot be substituted by anything else in the universe, is reduced to a heap of general sentiments I could have found anywhere else 100 times over. It's tough when you lose somebody you love, apparently clothed in language that's clunky, quirky, and far from properly polished. And yet, when understood and experienced implicitly, his poetry can alter your life. Another way of thinking of the difference between the hemispheres is to see the left hemisphere's world as tending towards fixity, whereas that of the right tends towards flow. All systems in nature, from particles to the greater universe, from the world of cellular processes to those of living beings, depend on a necessary balance of the forces for stasis with the forces for flow. All existing things, in fact, could be thought of as the product of this fruitful tension. But again, stasis itself is an illusion, helpful though it is in grasping the world on the wing. There's an intriguing condition called palinopsia, which follows damage to the right hemisphere. Here, vision becomes atomized, broken down like the successive stills of a juddering cine film, a series of static moments rather than a seamless flow. The left hemisphere's take on things comes from assessing thousands of points of information in turn and trying to reach a conclusion about the whole picture that way. This has the profoundest consequences for the way it sees the world, when contrasted with the take of the right hemisphere, which sees things as a whole, never as isolated particles independent of a context. It has a much broader vision, and so here would not be trying to put together, well, that splodge there looks like a bit of shade, and that splodge there looks like a bit of a dog. There's an aha moment when you see the whole thing. You couldn't build it up in the way the left hemisphere imagines. That illusion comes from the fact that when we ask ourselves after the event how we understood something, our linear processing left hemisphere comes up with the only way it knows, the way it would have had to do it if asked. Fortunately, we don't often ask it. We grasp the whole and only later choose to survey such particular parts as we prioritize for their interest or relevance. For example, here, most people see first an H and 4 and only later E's and 8's. The exception to this is in schizophrenia for all sorts of interesting reasons. So if anybody saw E's and 8's first, see me afterwards. There are other reasons. By seeing isolated points, the left hemisphere imagines that there are atomistically distinct entities, rather than seeing everything embedded in its context, which radically changes its nature, part of a web of interconnections. This part-wise method of understanding and resistance to the idea of things flowing and changing together go some way to explain the left hemisphere's affinity for what is mechanical or inanimate. Only the left hemisphere encodes tools and machines. You'll remember that the purpose of the left hemisphere is to allow us to manipulate the world, not to understand it. 6 separate studies have examined the issue, and each has found this to be the case. One found a complete divide, animate in the right, inanimate in the left. So marked is this effect that even the left-hander, who in daily life is using his or her right hemisphere to manipulate tools and machines, nonetheless usually encodes them in the left. Now, in the past, we would naturally model the world according to organic metaphors, the tree, the river, the family. Now we model everything the left hemisphere's way, mechanically. Once again, no one could pretend that this is more true to the world. It's just a handy shortcut, which enables us to model very well some aspects of its behavior for practical purposes, but radically excludes others. This way of thinking brings us to a further related issue, differences over the unique and the general, quality versus quantity. From the painstaking work of Elkin and Goldberg, a prominent US neuroscientist, we know that the right hemisphere seems to be involved more with new experience, new events, things, ideas, words, skills, or music, or whatever it may be, while they're still fresh, original, and unique, and so to speak, present to the mind. The right hemisphere's world is present, or more precisely, presence is to us, as Heidegger puts it. By contrast, the left hemisphere's world takes over once whatever it is represented, literally represented, presented after the fact, once it's familiar and known as an instance of something, a concept. The left hemisphere abstracts and generalizes, where the right hemisphere's world remains truer to each embodied instance and appreciates the unique. As things are present in all their particularity, with all their individual, incarnate qualities, they're mediated more by the right hemisphere. As they become general, abstract quantities, they're mediated more by the left. Of course, these abstractions and categories are once again less true to the world of experience, where no two things at all are ever the same, fixed, certain, or equal to anything else. But the left hemisphere process is a very important, rough and ready, quick and dirty take on the world, a way of helping us interact with the world swiftly and efficiently. The neuroscientist Ramachandran calls the right hemisphere the devil's advocate, because it's always interested in the particular, upsetting the left hemisphere's tendency to collapse, unlike into like, jump to conclusions, and see only what it's expecting to see. And it's the right hemisphere's capacity for vigilance, its ability to go against preconception, and its insistence in looking at things as they are and as they might not fit, and not as the theory dictates they must be, that allows us a way out of the hermeneutic circle that I mentioned. Now, all these features, the seeing of wholes, not parts, the understanding of context, of the unique, of the concrete rather than the abstract, of what changes and flows, of the living rather than the inanimate, would suggest that the right hemisphere would provide the neural ground of our sense of ourselves as embodied beings. And indeed, in a number of ways, that is exactly what we find. It's the right hemisphere that has the body image, which is not simply a visual image, but a complex image that unites information from all our many senses, and which sees the body as a whole. Damage to the right hemisphere can result in a vision of the body as an agglomeration of parts, without the sense of relation between them. The right hemisphere is also more richly connected with the limbic system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the main pathways through which our minds and bodies communicate. The left hemisphere's world is a representation only. It's a virtual world. It's like a map, useful precisely because almost all the information about the land to which it refers has been left out. For some purposes, less is more. If I'm traveling from London to Edinburgh, I really don't need to know about all the houses along the way and what the people are there like for supper and how they treat their dogs and what sort of plants they have in their gardens. This is vital for an understanding of the real world, the terrain, but not good for mastering the territory. To give you some idea of what I mean in practical terms, take a look at these pictures. Here you see in turn a tree as conceived by both hemispheres on the left, by the left hemisphere alone in the middle, and then by the right. You'll notice that compared with the flowing form of the right hemisphere's tree, seen whole and alive, the left hemisphere's tree is a fairly shrunken affair. And I want you to notice two features. In the first place, it's more like an icon of a tree, a token or representation of a tree, than a tree in the world as we know it. But this picture reveals another feature of the left hemisphere's world, which becomes particularly clear after a right hemisphere stroke. Under such circumstances, one has only the left hemisphere to go on, and true to its proper function, it's interested only in the part of space that is of use to it, the right half of space. It's not interested in understanding the world as a whole, only with having control of the bit it manipulates. And you can see this remarkable phenomenon on almost any acute general ward, medical ward. You can see this, it's not a rare phenomenon. Following a right hemisphere stroke, the patient may cease to attend to anything on the left, whether it be a person, the left-hand page of a book, or the left half of the page of the newspaper, and in extreme circumstances may forget to dress or shave the left half of the body. This has nothing to do with blindness. The visual system is intact, and it doesn't happen the other way around. Following a left hemisphere stroke, the right hemisphere delivers a complete world, not a half world. I put this one up just to show you how the left hemisphere doesn't deal so well with sense of depth in space, or in fact time, but that's another story. It tends to portray objects as children do, flattened into a plane. You see that particularly here in this interesting diagram from Gazzaniga and Ledoux. This is a commissurotomy patient. Before the operation, both hands can draw a passable cube in perspective with depth. After the operation, the right hand that's been doing it all its life can't do it because there's no way for the right hemisphere to give it the information. It can only send information to the left hand, which does a passable cube. If you look at these representations of a flower, you see that in the left hemisphere it's been reduced, that's the middle column, to a stereotyped geometric symbol of a flower. And look at these, all this time produced by the left hemisphere. Again, the complexity of the living world is reduced to a set of simple geometric figures. Take a look at the column that shows a person. I'm reminded of Emerson's pessimism about what was happening to human beings in the modern world. Man, he wrote, is a dwarf of himself. In the world of the left hemisphere, this is apparently true. The left hemisphere is not in touch with reality, but with its representation of reality, which turns out to be a remarkably simplified, self-enclosed, self-referring system of signs. I'd say the defining quality of the right hemisphere's world is that it exists in relations, what I call betweenness. Sounds better in German, by the way. Zwischenheit. It's got a gravitas there. This starts with it having a relationship with the world at large, not seeing it as a separate object ripe for manipulation. It's the right frontal cortex which underwrites what makes us social animals and makes us capable of empathy. Now, what I mean by betweenness is best thought of in terms of music. Music doesn't exist in one particular note, which in itself is meaningless, or in a lot of such single notes, each in itself meaningless. I'm tempted to say it exists more in the spaces than in the notes. The spaces between successive notes in pitch that creates the melody, the spaces between simultaneously sounding notes that is the harmony, the spaces in time between the beats that makes the rhythm. But that too, of course, is wrong because the spaces are just silence, apparently nothing. It's not in the spaces or the notes, but in the spaces and the notes together, plus whatever it is that comes about from their union. Suddenly becomes Schubert's C major quintet, which I defy anyone to listen to without it having a life-changing impact. And in this way, it's like electricity. It's not in the positive pole or the negative pole, or for that matter, just in the space between them, or the sum of all those, but in the whole system taken together. And that's what I mean by betweenness. It's what physics tells us the world is made of, not a universe of billiard balls pinging off one another in predictable ways. And it's what the human world, rightly understood, is made of too. Indeed, as Timothy Chappell suggested yesterday, along with Merleau-Ponty as well as Levinas, and as developmental psychology confirms in the research of Colwyn Trevarthen and Alan Shaw, the sense of the self grows out of the betweenness, not the other way round. It grows gradually through a process of reciprocal influence, the intercourse of mother's face with her baby's face, a process which incidentally relies largely on the right orbitofrontal cortex. Some people have thought I might be subtly decrying reason or exalting emotion, but in fact, of course, both hemispheres are involved in reasoning and in emotion. This is far too simple a way of thinking. The left hemisphere is especially good, in fact, at voluntary and social expressions of emotion, and one of the more clearly lateralized emotional registers is that of anger, which lateralizes to the left. Deeper and more complex expressions of emotion and the reading of faces are best dealt with, however, by the right hemisphere. As far as reason goes, the left hemisphere is better at carrying out certain procedures that involve manipulating numbers, but has less of a grasp than the right hemisphere of what those numbers mean. And that's a parallel with language. It has a more sophisticated syntax, but it doesn't understand the meaning of utterances as well as the right hemisphere. For example, if I say, it's hot in here, what you know is, would you please open the door, but that's your right hemisphere operating. Your left hemisphere thinks I'm just giving you interesting meteorological data. Much of mathematics is in fact dependent on the right hemisphere. Most of its great discoveries were perceived as complex patterns of relationships, and only later, often much later, translated painstakingly into linear sets of propositions. Deductive logic, it turns out, depends also on the right hemisphere. Reason is, of course, a very complicated concept. Some types of rationalizing can become unreasonable. Rationality, the schematic carrying out of algorithmic procedures in a way a machine would, is better done by the left hemisphere, it's true. But other kinds of reason, including the reason that takes into account the limits of reason, depends on the right hemisphere. There's a kind of reasoning and an extent of reasoning that is in many circumstances not only irrational, but actually one of the signs of madness. And as Aristotle emphasized, there are different kinds of reasoning, different kinds of knowledge, and different modes of understanding appropriate to different areas of life. We do not understand a poem, of course, as a doctor understands a patient, and that in turn is different from how an accountant understands a business plan. That's not a flaw in poetry or medical practice that could be remedied if only it were all rationalized mechanically, despite what administrators seem to think. There are three periods in our history when one can see in the values, the mores, the art, and the culture at large what looks like a fruitful balance of what each hemisphere has to offer. In ancient Greece in the 6th century, then in the late Roman Republic and early Augustan era, and again in our time since the Renaissance. Anyway, I haven't got time to justify these remarks at this stage. In each case, it's in the book. In each case, these periods were followed by a shift towards ways of thinking and being that are associated predominantly with the left hemisphere. And in each of the first two cases, the Greek and the Roman, civilization indisputably declined as this happened. One intriguing, measurable, and objective marker of right hemisphere engagement, because you might think it's just an image or a metaphor, concerns representation of the human face. There's a marked superiority in the right hemisphere for reading and identifying faces, for interpreting body language, for understanding implicit communication, for responding to individuals, and for expressing and receiving emotional signals through the face. In these humane and humanistic eras, where sculpture of the human form and face and the art of portraiture flourished and became more expressive, empathic, and individualized, research reveals that there is a shift of gaze in representations of the face towards the viewer's left, whereas before and after these periods, faces either Gorgon-like stared straight ahead or even tended to look to the viewer's right. The implication appears to be that the focus of interest comes to lie in the viewer's left visual field, preferentially subserved by the right hemisphere, at the same time that the more emotionally expressive left hemiface of the sitter, controlled by the subject's right hemisphere, is exposed to view. And incidentally, perspective and the portrayal of depth, a right hemisphere faculty, was also known to each of these cultures, and in each case was lost with their decline. Now, I'm just going to say some very, very brief, we're just going to have a little bit of, this will be rather abstract, this is slightly more concrete. I'm really putting this up to show that during the Middle Ages, we didn't, as happened in the Roman era, in the late Roman era certainly, paint lifelike pictures. We painted what we knew. And in this picture, what we knew was that the bishop was important, so he's painted bigger. And the poor little chap at the bottom on his horse going off somewhere, he's not important, so he's small. And as you can see, the perspective is clearly not right, but only 150 years later, you see a completely different sort of world has come into being, which has depth in both space and time, and your eye is drawn into it by the various ways in which planes of depth and the train of human figures carry you emotively into this picture. And of course, there is a sense of perspective in time. You know, man began to see himself in the Renaissance in a much broader perspective of time, because of course here there's a Roman sarcophagus, but it's linked to the present. The Florentine shepherds, they're wearing Florentine contemporary costumes in the 15th century. And this is just to show what happened to religion after the Reformation, where before people processed and used symbols and metaphors and images, it became very much a matter of the word exalted there in that pupil over the pulpit over people's heads, and the obedient people are static and laid out, nicely ordered, like something on a sheet of graph paper. And that led on to the Enlightenment, in which, of course, one can say that the divorce between mind and matter, between the body and its head, started to become a major problem for us. And of course the French Revolution, in fact, perfected a technique for separating the head from the body. And this is really just an excuse to put up one of my favorite slides. It's really to show, of course, it's just down the road in the Ashmolean, the last painting of Claude, the Ascanius and the Stag. And really it's just to show you how what this picture is not representative, actually. The agents in it are colour and texture and light and planes of depth, and the sense of a huge perspective in space and a huge perspective in time, because this ruin already has millennia of wear on it, 2,500 years ago. And this is just to remind us that the Reformation and the Enlightenment did have a little bit of a reverse in the period that's rather dismissively known as Romanticism. It's an unfortunate term, during which some of the most sophisticated philosophy was actually done. But I like this just because it describes this moment when Blake was inspired by the spirit of Milton. It describes Milton circling the universe and then landing, as he says in the poem, on the left tarsus. He's very specific about it, and of course he drew it for us rather nicely here. And what I like about that is that the left tarsus is represented deep in the interhemispheric fissure, on the right side, very close to the limbic system, which is very much involved in intuitive and emotional understanding. Well, this is really just to show what happened. Harmony and perspective, which came with the Renaissance, both left with the 20th century, and we have these rather witty and amusing disruptions of perspective which are deliberately alienated. And this poor lady looks as though she slipped getting out of the bath, probably because her head's rather small in comparison to the rest of her body. We could give her a scan, I suppose. And then we come forward to the modern era, really, where reality is just an illusion painted on the surfaces, and it's something we project from our minds onto basically a blank, a nothing. Well, the most curious aspect of the influence of the left hemisphere is, in fact, the way in which a self-consistent system of signs can come to seem more real than the lived world itself. The first evidence of this comes from about the 4th century BC, just as Greek culture was beginning to pass its peak. Until that point, from the 6th century BC onwards, we'd seen an almost unparalleled flowering of science and the arts based on the best of what both right and left hemispheres in conjunction can offer. From the right hemisphere came careful observation of the natural world. The pre-Socratic philosopher Thales correctly predict an eclipse of the sun. A sense of the uniqueness of the individual with interests that need to be harmonized with those of the community, which itself was seen as a living, changing entity that was more than the sum of its parts. And there arose for the first time wonderful expressive depictions of the human face, narratives of human lives, and poetry rich in metaphor. It gave rise to the phenomenon of drama, whereby we see ourselves more clearly at a distance, but not in some detached and lifeless way, but able more than ever to empathize. There was a keen sense of what needed to remain implicit, an understanding of the all-important conjunction of opposites, and perhaps most strikingly, a sense of proportion and a sense of humor. From the left hemisphere came the working out of the fruits of natural observation into useful predictions of behavior of natural bodies, the codification of laws, the creation of maps, the development of some aspects of mathematics, the introduction of monetary currency, the further evolution of written language, at this point starting for the first time to be written, as now in the West only, from left to right, which favors the left hemisphere, and in general, the systematization of knowledge. But gradually, with the rise of the law of non-contradiction, which limited our ability to appreciate important truths that are not necessarily mutually compatible, the way of seeing the world characteristic of the left hemisphere for the first time began to obtrude. The ideal, theoretical world began to triumph over that of experience. We find Plato saying that the right way to do astronomy is not to look at the stars, but to look inside ourselves. And suddenly there's a flurry of interest in what was called paradox, when our theories about the world, our ways of thinking, come face to face with reality and show themselves to be inadequate to understanding the world. And of course, you'll all be familiar with the ship of Theseus paradox, also known as the growing paradox, because it arises in the case of all living things. It's an analogue of the problem that few of the cells in my body were there a year ago. So is it still my body? To anyone seeing the whole and who realizes that everything flows, the answer is clearly yes. As Novalis remarked, our body is a molded river. However, to someone who sees only parts and believes that permanence is stasis, the answer is no. Or take the paradox called the division. It reduces flow to a series of still frames. It is similar to Achilles and the tortoise, only it goes one step further. It states that movement's impossible because before I go from here to the door, I must first go half the way, and before half I must go a quarter, before a quarter an eighth, and this is, of course, an infinite series. So I'm condemned to stand here forever, which may not be in your best interest. What is fascinating is the rationalistic left hemisphere's conclusion, not that this kind of logic has its limits in understanding the world, but that the experiential world somehow doesn't measure up to logic. The real world isn't the way we think it is because logic says so, and in reality Achilles can apparently never overtake the tortoise. Beautifully designed experimental research shows that the left hemisphere sees truth as internal coherence of the system, not correspondence with the reality we experience. Marcel Kinsborn and a Russian colleague gave subjects a syllogism with a false premise and asked them whether it was true. They did this in 3 conditions: intact and with one hemisphere at a time isolated. So, for example, all monkeys climb trees. The porcupine is a monkey. The porcupine climbs trees. Between you and me, annoyingly, there are porcupines that climb trees, but the Russian experimenters and their subjects didn't know that, so put that out of your mind for the time being. In the intact condition, the subject replies, no, it's not true, the porcupine isn't a monkey, it's prickly, it runs on the ground. With the left hemisphere isolated and the right hemisphere suppressed, the same individual, this is not a different person, it's the same person, replies that it's true. When asked if a porcupine is a monkey, she replies she knows it's not. So why is it true? She replies, because that's what it says on this piece of paper. When the right hemisphere of the same individual is asked, she replies indignantly, how can it be? It's wrong here. The porcupine's not a monkey. Now, I'm constantly reminded as I go about life in the modern Western world of a story by Yuri Tinyanov called Lieutenant Kizia. Published in 1927, the story concerns an error of transcription in an official list of the Imperial Army, whereby the word poruchiki, lieutenant, gets conflated with a subsequent syllable, zhil, seeming to refer to a certain Poruchik Kizia, a Lieutenant Kizia who never existed. Despite this apparent drawback, Lieutenant Kizia plays a starring role in subsequent military reports, rises through the ranks, where he never gets into trouble and is known for his dependability, marries, fathers a child, is decorated for bravery, and finally finds himself promoted by the Tsar to the rank of general. Mysteriously, when the Tsar demands to meet this human paragon, he cannot be found. The Tsar, in despair, mutters sic transit gloria mundi and accords him a state funeral. Meanwhile, a Lieutenant Sinyukhaev, who was years ago wrongly recorded as dead, struggles fruitlessly to assert that, contrary to received opinion, he's very much alive and ends up a vagabond on the highways of Russia, relying on the charity of strangers. Now, if, as I believe, there have been shifts in hemispheric balance, I do not think this implies that changes in the brain structure itself have driven changes in brain function, except in the sense that function inevitably changes structure and then reciprocity. The brain's not, of course, a TV set, but the situation is more like a change of channel than a change in the wiring of the set. It's a matter of which set of constraints we wish to apply, which channels we wish to tune into, and which filter out. We wouldn't find much of interest if we went back and looked at the brain of pre-Achaean man. I suspect it would look much like ours. Thus, my point is not that culture can in some sense be reduced to or is driven by the brain. Not at all. It's that the brain necessarily limits our options in predictable patterns. In an era where we're locked in, as I believe, to the view of the left hemisphere, it can help alert us to the fact that we're using only half our faculties, and the poorer half at that. I'm going to conclude by just taking a look at what the world would be like if the left hemisphere really was the one on which we largely relied in our lives and in our views about society. Well, there'd be all these things. There'd be a loss of the broader picture. Knowledge would become replaced by information, tokens or representations, and the idea of wisdom would become some terrible old superstition. There'd be a loss of the concepts of skill and judgment, which should be reduced to algorithms. There'd be simultaneous abstraction and reification. that amphibious nature that I'm talking about is not possible for it to conceive. Bureaucracy, well, it would flourish according to Berger's criteria for bureaucracy, which are procedures that are known, anonymous, organizable, predictable, and explicitly abstract, and where justice is reduced to the mere concept of equality. There'd be a loss of the sense of uniqueness, quantity would become the only criterion, and there would be a generally either-or way of looking at things. The right hemisphere can tolerate for long periods ambivalence and ambiguity, but the left hemisphere needs to have it cut and dried. Systems would be designed to maximize utility. There'd be a loss of social cohesion. The left hemisphere needs to control things and feels anxious when it's not able to control them, and so there'd be a general air of paranoia and lack of trust. This is what happens in certain psychiatric conditions. There'd be a need for this total control, but at the same time we'd see ourselves as the passive victims of others' deeds. Reasonableness would become replaced by rationality, and that very uncommon thing, common sense, would generally fail. There'd be a general increase in anger and aggression in our relations. There'd be a dangerously unwarranted optimism, because the left hemisphere tends to be overconfident in itself. I didn't have time to talk about that, but it's quite amusing. And the deliberate undercutting of the sense of awe or wonder, which are things that it can't understand. Flow would be just the sum of an infinite series of pieces. We would discard tacit forms of knowing. We become strangled by that network of small, complicated rules that was envisaged by de Tocqueville in the 1830s. We'd be spectators rather than actors in our lives, and art would become conceptual. Visual art would lack a sense of depth, and there'd be distorted or bizarre perspectives. Music would be reduced to little more than rhythm, the bit that the right hemisphere is good at. It's not much good, except for the interesting exception of professional musicians in dealing with melody or harmony. And language would become diffuse, excessive, and lacking in concrete reference. So if that sounds at all familiar to you, I think there's maybe something in the idea that we now live in a world which is fairly much dominated by this particular way of looking at the world, which can actually be seen to be largely based on the conception of the world offered us by our left hemispheres. And I've sometimes been asked, what would the world look like if the right hemisphere was in the driving seat? And the answer, of course, is very balanced, because the right hemisphere understands the need for the left, but the left doesn't understand the need for the right. In a Rumsfeldian way, it's not aware of what it's not aware of. The left hemisphere's stance is also competitive. It's either or. And actually, it may sound figurative, but it's actually true at the electrophysiological level, that it's more able to inhibit the right hemisphere than the right is the left, and the right gives more information to the left than the left is willing to give back to the right. So that, of course, is what is meant by the metaphor in the title, The Master and His Emissary, that one actually sees more than the other, but needs the other to do certain things of which it cannot be aware, but that emissary must come back to the master with the information where it can be reintegrated into the whole picture. So when the brain is working right, our first conceptions of things come from the right hemisphere. They're then helpfully unpacked and processed in all sorts of ways that make it richer in the left, and then that is reintegrated in an image in the right. And I was just recently in Toronto, and I gave a talk, and afterwards a woman came up to the microphone and she said, I teach 5 to 10-year-olds, and in the last 3 years, my colleagues and I have noticed that we actually have to teach children how to read the human face. And normally, only children with autism would have to be learnt that kind of thing. And I've had emails from teachers who don't know one another who've said very similar things in this way. I used to have a task I gave to my class every year. In 30 years of teaching, I can only remember one person who couldn't do it. In the last few years, 30 to 40% of the class have difficulty doing it. And what does this depend on? Sustained attention. And if you put that together with research that suggests that children are measurably less empathic than they were 30 or 40 years ago, it looks like there might be something in what I'm saying, because reading the human face, being empathic, and sustaining attention are all cardinal features of distinction between the right hemisphere, which underwrites them, and the left hemisphere that can't. So I'm going to probably leave it there, and I hope that people will ask me questions.
grateful to you personally, Iain, for showing us how neuroscience can add to our humanity and not detract from it, as some people tend to think. And your masterpiece is an extraordinary testament of about 20 years' work to produce that book. And I have to say, I'm personally grateful for the insights that you've given to us in that work. We have a few minutes now for questions. I think it's the three at the back almost simultaneous. So maybe Murray first, and then the two gentlemen behind.
I love the talk. So this is perhaps a slightly mischievous question, but towards the beginning of the talk, you said that the views of the left and the right hemisphere are synthesized in consciousness. So how does that work then?
Well, I think the answer is that it's very hard to track because, of course, with imaging one has a blur of 3 to 5 seconds, so one can't see processes that are happening at millisecond to millisecond interval that way. But there is thought to be a meta control region in the midbrain which allots attention to either hemisphere, and it works at levels of milliseconds, or hundreds anyway of milliseconds. So that is probably how it happens. We probably rapidly alternate things. But for certain tasks, we can settle into a certain view over longer phenomenological tranches of experience.
Yeah, gentleman just behind, yes, and then behind him.
I haven't read your book, I'm afraid. Again, it was a very fascinating talk. I'm trying to understand the various steps in this project. Obviously, there's a lot of reading of individual studies, and individual studies have quite prosaic results generally. Then there's a process of generalization of those results to get to these kind of quite broad categories that you have examples here. And then you're saying, I as an individual person with both hemispheres normally connected, you're saying something like, I think you are at least, what kind of person would I be like if I were only like the left or the right? So you've also stressed that we're all very affected by our sets, to use a slightly different terminology, our background, our presumptions. And yet you're asking us to believe your individual synthesis.
Well, of course, that's always the case with any piece of work of any kind. So it's not different in any way from just the terms on which we have experience and can talk to one another. I can't convince you of something you can't be convinced of. But I hope that if you do get around to reading my book, you will see the research, the very large amount of research that's drawn on that. I think what I'm not saying.
Much more specific. If it were, you could make it more scientific by inviting other people to consider the data you considered and see whether they come to the same categorization. That's the point I'm making.
There's an open invitation. Please go ahead. It may take a while, is the only thing, but please do. I mean, I'd be delighted. I hope that people will. What I try to do is what you've heard today is something which is already a distillate of something else, which is a synthesis. You're getting something that is so thin that I'm not surprised that you wouldn't necessarily, you need to know a lot more, perfectly correctly. But what I can say is that I've looked at different areas of experience, probably about artificially divided experience into about 20, 25 different areas. Things like body, depth, space, time, and so on, such time. And in all these cases, I've looked at all that I can find in the literature on hemispheric difference. And what I've done is...
I'm sorry, you're a psychiatrist. You've all kinds of preconceived ideas.
Well,
you said that yourself.
Yes, I can't be a god. I can only be a human being, and of course human beings have preconceived ideas. What I have tried to do, and it's up to you to take a look and show me I'm wrong, is look at the evidence and weigh it up and see where there is a fairly consistent body of evidence pointing in a certain direction. And I've tried never actually to base anything purely on neuroimaging.
Thank you. Fascinating talk. I want to just ask about how to connect where we end up as a description of the left hemisphere world with where you began, where you were saying, well, after the initial excitement about the hemispheres, the assignment of functions to hemispheres, and then discovering, well, actually, they're both involved in everything, kind of thing. It's almost, I just want to get clear on what your claim is at this point. Is it that the left hemisphere is both involved in the atomistic and the holistic, but more in the atomistic, and whilst the right hemisphere is more involved in the holistic, but is also involved in the atomistic? Or again, with quality and quantity, is it that both hemispheres are involved in both kinds of processing or appreciation, but the left hemisphere a little bit more so, the kind of balance you would get after summing up a large number of studies? Or do you think that that sort of synthesis is something which only happens with the normal deployment of both hemispheres? I mean, would we get something as leftist as this description of a left hemisphere world, or would there be all these rightist elements in, but they would still be, more minor?
Look, absolutely right. I mean, of course, nothing in nature, nothing in the human body, nothing in medicine, nothing in psychiatry, nothing in neuroscience is cut and dry. So, these are, in a way, you can generalize quite confidently that men are taller than women, but you can find women that are taller than men, and so forth. So, there's that's really the answer to the first point. But there's another point in there, which is that I wasn't saying, I think you've mixed up two things in a way, if I may not have made it clear. What I was saying is, when you look at the content, as it were, the areas of life, the things that the brain as a machine would be doing, does it do this kind of... I was saying that they're both involved in those, but they're much more sharply distinguished by the ways in which they do those. So, yes, although they're both involved in reason and emotion, one, or in visuospatial or language or whatever, quite consistently, one is using a much more connected, flowing, holistic way, and quite consistently the other one is doing more pinning down particulars in a certain sort of mode, if you like to put it that way. So the modes are more distinct, but actually, of course, nothing is 100%. And indeed, categories, of course, are inevitably made by both hemispheres. Interestingly, they're made in different ways and refer to different levels of category. So more superordinate levels of category are more stored in the left hemisphere and more manipulated by the left hemisphere. As you get more to subordinate and smaller categories, and more closer to the unique, they tend to be more amenable to and underwritten by the right hemisphere. So it's a complicated picture. And in the book, you will find there are many, many qualifications and nuances that I simply can't possibly... you'd be even more bored than you are now if I'd gone into all that. So there we are.
I also enjoyed very much your beautifully formulated and crisp talk. You started by sketching an evolutionary genesis of these two hemispheres. We need two types of attention. One is very focused, birds have to pick grains, and the other type is very open because we need to detect predators and so on and so on. And then you sketch this difference between the left and the right hemisphere. But you didn't only describe or explain these things, you seem to evaluate them as well. You said, for instance, that the left hemisphere is illusionary to the extent that it doesn't depict reality. Now, if the evolutionary explanation is right, certainly when the bird wants to pick a grain, that hasn't to be illusionary. The grain has to be there. So I thought that the evaluations were mainly partly mistaken, although the description and the explanation of the generalist might be right. But the very evolutionary explanation means that surely the left hemisphere cannot be illusionary. It has to be as realistic, although more focused, as the other hemisphere.
Well, thank you very much. And I didn't convey the point I wanted to make very clearly there. What I hope I did say, and I think I did, was that actually both hemispheres' takes offer us some truth about the world. They're able to give us some true information. So in that sense, they're not illusory. But in the sense, what I tried to point out is that one is really a tool of the other. The left hemisphere is a useful way of trying to sort out our interface with the world so that we can get food and shelter and do things. But in terms of understanding, its vision is very narrow. It's the things that it draws on are narrower. I mean, it's literally true in terms of scope of vision, scope of lovely study done years ago where, before neurosurgery, before you start whacking things out of bits of people's temporal lobe because they've got epilepsy, you do a little test on them. You isolate one hemisphere at a time and find out which one does the talking, so that at least you know to spare the speech area on the right side, the correct side. And while doing this, psychologists had a good idea. Oh, this gives us an opportunity to give these people questionnaires. So they gave them questionnaires to answer about their own personality, and they gave them also to their loved ones and friends and family. And it turned out that the left hemisphere's take on itself was remarkably optimistic and rather highly polished. The right hemispheres were closer to the truth, but somewhat on the tarnished side. These different tapes are fascinating. I mean, for example, when there's an injury to the body, if there's an injury to the right side of the body and the left hemisphere is damaged, but the right hemisphere is aware of it, it's devastating. But if there's an injury on the left side and it's completely paralyzed, the person will often completely deny there's a problem. You go to see them after a stroke and say, everything all right? And they say, yes, fine, yes, thank you. And you say, so any problems on the left side? And you go, no. Can you move your left hand? They go, yeah, no, I did it. And you say, well, I didn't see anything move. They said, you did? And you bring it right round in front of them and say, there, move it. And they don't. And they say, oh, it doesn't belong to me. It belongs into the bloke in the next bed. Now these are not psychotic patients. These are perfectly rational individuals who've lost a bit of their world. And what they like to do is deny that there is a problem, which may be very dangerous at the moment, because I think we're ambling like a sleepwalker, whistling a happy tune towards the abyss.
Ian, just in response to the first question, I have to say, as someone who's read the book, it is a mighty, mighty work of scholarship. It is extraordinary work of scholarship. But I'm quite interested in a way. You're very snooty about the left hemisphere. And in fact, I quote you, explicitness kills, it renders lifeless, and so on. I think a lecture, and in particular a book, is a left hemisphere product.
It is.
So in many ways, you must be rather snooty about your book, and possibly to a lesser extent about your lecture, because you're engaging us in eye contact and so on. So I would like to know what you think is the status of this left hemisphere product you've produced.
Yeah.
And secondly, that's the first question. The second question is, from which hemisphere do you observe the two others in order to make a comparison between them? In other words, do you have a third hemisphere in order to allocate blasts and blessers to the right and left?
Both very nice questions. The first thing is, you're not by any means the first person who's pointed out that my book is extremely left hemispheric. It's a carefully constructed argument. It's Marshall's data, but of course looking at the real world is very right hemisphere. What's actually going on outside the window, where porcupines are not monkeys, is quite important. So yes, it's a synthesis of these two things. And first of all, I would say that any enterprise worth its salt is going to have to draw on both. I actually spend a lot of my time these days going around the country speaking up to the left hemisphere, because people are far too ready to dismiss it. And I mean, in a slightly jokey way, because it makes it more fun, I have been, yes, a little frivolous about the left hemisphere perhaps today, but of course, I mean, we wouldn't have a civilization without the left hemisphere. We wouldn't have any drains, houses, food, or anything else. And an awful lot of things that matter also in the intellectual world depend on the proper use of those. My argument is not that we need just to be involved with the right hemisphere. This is a constant mistake made by people who are so into the left hemisphere's take. It's got to be either or. It isn't, it's both and. And we need both. And I hope I did that in the sense that although I use left hemisphere tools, I try to transcend its own conclusion. Maths can be used as Gödel did to show the limits of maths.
Which brings it back, how did you manage to transcend both your hemispheres in order to make a comparison between them and to allocate the blasts and the blessers?
That was your second question. And I think it's a good one, but I think one needs to have a place. Of course, it's ludicrous to suppose one has a place outside of it. But what one can see is use and listen to what one knows, if you like, from both. And all I would say is that the right hemisphere understands the need for both, and the left hemisphere doesn't understand the need for more than what it knows. Now, there's a problem there. This is the Rumsfeldian one that I referred to. And what I would say is that when you're using them both together,
possibly two more questions. The lady behind Peter had a question, but otherwise I'll give it to Peter Hacker. Peter, do you want to take that? Or the lady who had your hand up earlier, do you still want to take a question? No? Okay. Maybe, which lady? Okay, maybe Peter. Would you like to ask you a question? I'm very curious about this one.
Thank you. Iain, at the beginning of your lecture, I see. At the beginning of this lecture, you laid out very fairly your claim that the manner in which you're speaking is a façon de parler, that of course the left hemisphere doesn't think, reason, understand, etc. It's the person whose left hemisphere it is who engages in these intellectual activities. And then for the rest of the talk, you spoke, as it were, with the façon de parler fully in place. Now, I'm not at all sure how you will translate much of what you've said back into ordinary language about people and their activities. You talk very happily of the left hemisphere's take and the right hemisphere's take, the left hemisphere's vision, the right hemisphere's vision. Now, as far as I can see, what this means translated back into English is that we have different capacities. We have intellectual tendencies towards generalization. We also have intellectual tendencies towards careful attention to detail and connectedness. We have tendencies towards quantification and careful attention to whatever can be measured, and we also have intellectual capacities and tendencies to qualitative differences of endlessly subtle kinds. We are a single human being, not two human beings struggling to dominate one over the other. What you're recommending, it seems to me, can be recommended without very much attention at all to the hemispheres, namely that we found ourselves in a cultural situation today in which our bureaucracies dominate, in which whatever can't be quantified isn't real and doesn't really matter anyway, and so on and so forth. We all know the litany. And you're recommending, very wisely, that this is an appalling way to be going. But do you need this paraphernalia? After all, you say, if not for the left hemisphere, if not for the left hemisphere, I presume we'll be dead. And if not for the right hemisphere, we'll be dead as well, pretty much so. If you say, right, if people have terrible damage to one hemisphere, then this will bring out some of their dispositions and tendencies of this kind as opposed to that kind. And that's clearly, I take it, absolutely true. But still, I'm not sure how you integrate what you said in your, if you like, figurative, metaphorical way, how you integrate it in a description that is washed clean of this.
Yes, I mean, I did say that using language in this area is fraught with problems, and it's usually easier to say what doesn't work than to say what exactly would. But I think the point that you're making is not the linguistic point. The point is, does the brain really add anything? I think it basically something like that. No. Okay. I thought when you said all this paraphernalia, I thought you meant the brain.
No. Look. The point is how to describe the phenomena without being misleading.
Well,
I don't think there's any deficiency in English which prevents English from being adequate to the task, or any other human language. You've chosen to describe the exercise of a diverse range of human capacities, which you've classified into two, very roughly and perfectly decently, into two groups. And you've chosen to describe the exercise of those capacities in terms of the activities in the brain which endow us with those capacities, or at least make them possible. But you've uniformly gone on to describe the phenomena in terms of interaction between the hemispheres of the brain, as if one hemisphere is doing this sort of thinking and the other hemisphere is doing that sort of thinking. Well, neither hemisphere is doing any thinking. It's the human being that does the thinking. In doing the thinking that human beings do, they may call upon capacities which are dependent to a lesser or greater degree on one half of one hemisphere or the other. Right? That's at least a sketch of the story when it's told without the paraphernalia. Right? That is, without attributing to either hemisphere any capacities, but attributing all the capacities to the human being, some of which capacities depend to a large degree on one hemisphere, and some of the capacities depend to a large degree on the other hemisphere. But the hemispheres of the brain are not tools we use in any sense. They aren't tools and we don't use them. What we use are our capacities.
Yes, I think I did say that actually, but anyway, I think we could get bogged down forever in how we talk about it, and where I'm slightly, of a mind to say most people can see there's something important here, but language can sometimes make it sound like there isn't. But I think the point I would probably make is that I said at the outset that there's nothing here that couldn't be known without the brain. I did say that. And what I'm saying is that it can help us see things. It enables us to have a different slant or perspective on it. And I suppose that might be quite important in an era when one has to point out to people that a very insightful and important part of our being would not see the world the way that we think intelligent people must see it. We now think a lot of people go around thinking that the only way to see things, what they've learned from science, is that everything should be understood in terms of sort of rationalistic mechanisms. And it may be only rhetorically useful to say to them, actually the part of your brain that sees more would tell you something different. And I think that's I didn't say that you could never have found all this out by some other route. And indeed, what fascinates me is that in many traditions in Eastern philosophy, in the Kabbalah, which is particularly interesting, and in pre-Socratic philosophy, and then again in Hegel, and in many places in philosophy, one finds people essentially, I would say, cognizing the structure of their own minds by expressing it in this way. So it can be got at from the inside, and all I'm really doing is providing people with a very concrete image of how they're, a sort of map or reference point to look at their mental function. But I accept that, as soon as one starts to use language about it, there's a problem. I agree with you, the problem's not in the English language. It's in the way in which we insist on making things absolutely precisely used in the way they normally are in daily talk, because you can't do that when you're talking about the brain.
I have to say, unfortunately, we probably have to draw to a close soon. But what I do encourage you is to keep those questions, because we're going to have a period for discussion later, more open discussion later in the conference. And I see it's obviously your talk's obviously stimulated quite a lot of issues. So we really have to draw to a close there, I'm afraid. I just must make just two brief apologies. First of all, apologies to Group A. This morning, the chairman didn't arrive from London, so I'm afraid you didn't have a chairman there. I think Ray or other people just stepped in to do that. Thank you for that. And also, AC Grading has had to give his apologies. He can't make it this afternoon. Fortunately, however, we do have a philosopher with a head of hair that's almost as magnificent. And Professor Roger Scruton will be talking on the humanities in the face of brain science at 4:30 this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed.